If you have your Bibles, we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 14, verse 24 to 33. That's Matthew 14, 24 to 33. By this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, from the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you to the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed a strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt yourself?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So I was 17 when I first began to learn how to drive. Driving now seems like a piece of cake, and I like to think that I'm a pretty good driver. Unlike some who might be nervous behind the wheel, I really enjoy driving. Being the extrovert that I am, I get excited when I can give a ride to a friend. But you see, when I was 17, it was all new to me. It was scary, it was frightening, I was terrified. At first, I dreaded driving, but I understood that I would have to learn at some point. So, I remember the first time I got behind the wheel of my dad's white 2000 Chevy Colorado. He was in the passenger seat, right there beside me, and I was behind the wheel. We were on our county road, and there was no one around. But it was still frightening. It was daunting. For our first practice, all I had to do was barely lift my foot off the brake and slowly drive straight. So, why was this so terrifying? Why was this so nerve-wracking? Dad, I can't do it. I just can't. Why do you have fear, son? I'm right here with you. If you mess up, I'll just take the steering wheel and guide you. You've got this. I've got this. Over time, my driving skills got better and better, and now I think I'm pretty good at it. But you see, when I was just starting out, I was terrified. It was a new unknown for me. I didn't know how it was going to turn out, and yet Dad was with me. And as we look at this passage in Matthew's Gospel, we see that just as my dad was with me, Jesus was with Peter. He was with the disciples. And as the waves crashed around them, they were uncertain of what would happen next. They were facing their unknown. But Jesus reminded them not to be afraid and to trust in him. And you know what? They survived. What this passage should remind us today, in the midst of so many unknowns, so many challenges, so many circumstances that we simply can't wrap our brains around, is that God is with us. God is with us. So today, I want you to walk away with 3 truths that this passage shows us, and then I will offer a word of encouragement in these trying times. Throughout this message, it is my hope that you will see and be reminded for days and weeks and months to come that God is with us. The first truth I want you to see as we look at this passage is that we will face trials, but we are not alone. We will face trials, but we are not alone. If you look back at verse 24, it says this: "By this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them." In this scene, the disciples are facing a tremendous storm. Their boat is tossing. They are far from land, out in the middle of the sea. The verse says that the wind was against them. This doesn't exactly paint a picture of everything going well for the disciples. And I'm sure it was quite terrifying to be in the middle of all of this. As I look at this passage, my thought is, wow, what a tremendously daunting experience for these disciples to go through. It's a reminder to us that we will face storms in our own lives. We will face trials like the disciples did. Right now, those winds and waves might represent this pandemic. It seems as if this pandemic is a mighty foe challenging us at every turn. It's battering our boat, our lives, our global community. As the disciples were far from land in their storm, we may wonder, when will we reach the shore? When will our trials come to an end? Perhaps the pandemic is your storm, whether it be added anxiety, health worries, seeing others suffer, especially those you love. Perhaps you're also facing other storms. Maybe it's depression or the loss of a loved one. Maybe you're a teacher desperately missing your students right now. Whatever your storm may be, it may cause us to wonder, am I alone? Am I alone? And the simple answer to that is no. We are not alone. We are not alone. Verse 25 through 27 says, "And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking toward them on the sea, they were terrified, saying, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, 'Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid.'" What this text reminds me is that even in the midst of our storms, God is there, and we are not alone. In this passage, the disciples' boat is being tossed about by the wind and the waves, and it's early in the morning, probably in the final watch, so this was about between 2 or 3 in the morning and sunrise, perhaps at 6 o'clock. So we know that it was early in the morning, and the disciples are undoubtedly terrified. But what does Jesus do? He sees their distress and walks toward them. You see, for Jesus, the wind and the waves, they don't faze him. Matthew reminds us in the image of how God rules over the seas. Psalm 77:19, "Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty water, yet your footprints were unseen." Isaiah 43:16 says this, "Thus says the Lord, who makes a way in the sea, a path in the mighty waters." So, you see, God is more powerful than the wind and waves that crash around us. He's more powerful than the storms we are facing, whether they be COVID-19 or any other storm. He reaches out. He is there in our time of need and distress. And so, will we recognize that he is there for us? That he is with us? When he was first approaching the disciples, they were scared. They thought they saw a ghost. But how does Jesus respond? By reassuring the disciples in verse 27, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. He's telling them, I am here. He reminds them that they are not alone. In our storms, we are reminded that we are not alone. So take heart. Jesus is here with us. Brothers and sisters, we will face trials, but we are not alone. So, knowing that we will face trials and we are not alone, we must be reminded to trust in God and do not be afraid. Trust in God and do not be afraid. As we look back at this text, we pick up with verses 28 and 29. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He, Jesus, said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. Here we see Peter saying, "If it's you." Some have argued that this is an expression of assuming a condition to be true. So Peter knew it was Jesus, and he got out of the boat and stepped onto the water. I was recently reading a commentary on this passage. The commentary was written by a professor at Stewart I have gotten to know. In his commentary, Dr. David Garland states that Peter had enough faith to venture out of the boat and try the impossible. So Jesus tells Peter to come towards him. He reminds Peter that he will face the winds and the waves with him. We can relate that to our own lives by remembering that Jesus faces our wind and waves with us. You see, we can face the waters when our eyes are on Jesus, when we are focused on him. So even in the midst of whatever storms you are facing, trust in God. Focus your eyes on him. We will face trials, brothers and sisters, but God will face them with us. As we trust in God in the midst of our trials, we must remember to not be afraid. Now, I know that's easier said than done. We, after all, are human beings who will experience fear. There will be moments in our lives where fear is a part of us. But when God says, "Do not be afraid," he is reminding us that he is so much bigger than our fears. We will be afraid from time to time. I was afraid when first learning to drive. The disciples were afraid as the storm rocked their boat. And yet, God reminds us that he is bigger than our fears. So do not be afraid. As we are drawn once again to the text, verses 30 through 31 says, "But when he, Peter, noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying, 'You have little faith, why did you doubt?'" You see, as long as Peter had his eyes focused on Jesus, he was walking on the water with him. The waves and wind will still be chaotic, but this should remind us to focus our eyes on Jesus because he walks through these storms with us. Jesus was with me when I first learned how to drive. He was with Peter, and he is with us now in today's storms. So do not be afraid. God is bigger than all of our fears. What happened to Peter is that he let his fear take a hold of him, and he moved his eyes away from Jesus. And so the wind and the waves caused him to sink. Our storms can overwhelm us when we lose sight of God's presence in our very lives. They can cause us to sink. And I'm not saying that there won't be times when we're overwhelmed as we continue focusing on God, but we must be reminded that he is with us. He is able to give us peace in the midst of our chaos, so do not fear. Just as Jesus asked Peter, why did he doubt? He reminds us to not doubt his power. He will see us through this, so do not be afraid. As we trust in God, let us be reminded to not be afraid, for God is with us. And this leads me to point number 3, my final point. What I want you to remember most today. It's 4 simple words. God is with us. God is with us. For me, this is what I need to be reminded of most often in the midst of not only this pandemic, but also the many trials I have faced in my own life. It gives me hope and reassurance to know that God is with us. I want to turn our attention back to this text, verses 32 and 33. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." After he reminded Peter not to be afraid in such a tangible way by pulling him back up over the waves, Jesus got into the boat with Peter. And what happened? The wind ceased. The storm ended. You see, in the midst of the wind and waves that crash around us, even when we take our eyes off of Jesus, he is there. He is with us. And he will take us back to the boat, back to calmer days. And although we may not know when it will happen, the storms we are facing will eventually cease. You see, God is with us in our storms during our darkest, most troublesome hours. And then when things get better, he is still there. He has the power to calm the storm. And this story serves as a wonderful reminder that life won't always be easy. A lot of times it's chaotic. The wind and the waves overwhelm us at times. Occasionally we lose focus and start to sink. But here is the awesome truth. In all of this, God is with us. He will see us through this. And when it all ends, he will continue to be with us. And just as the disciples witnessed Jesus' power and his divine majesty, that he is the Son of God, we will know that he is with us and is more powerful than whatever we face. And as the disciples praised him and worshiped him, may we be reminded to do the same, knowing that even in our storms, God is with us. During this pandemic, being sheltered in place at home, I have had the opportunity to watch various movies. I especially have enjoyed biopics that tell a story of a certain point in one's life. After watching Selma, which is about the struggle for voting rights, and watching All the Way, which looks at President Lyndon Johnson working with Martin Luther King Jr., I decided to listen to some encouraging messages from Dr. King. I thought I would share part of a sermon he gave not long after white supremacists tried to bomb his home. Thankfully, his family were unharmed, but it was one of the many instances where Dr. King was undoubtedly scared. I want to share with you a little of what he said, and because I feel that paraphrasing wouldn't do his words justice, these are his words. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm awake now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage, and I can't let people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." Then it happened, and it seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world." I heard the voice of Jesus saying, still, to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me alone. Never to leave me alone. You see, throughout his life and ministry, Dr. King had every right to fear at times as he pursued racial equality in the midst of so much violence and hatred. But even in those dark moments of his life, he was reminded of God's promise to never leave him alone. Sisters and brothers, God is with us. God is with us. So we will face trials, and we are not alone. We must be reminded to trust in God and not be afraid. And we must remember that God is with us. God is with us. The wonderful reality of knowing and serving God is remembering that he is always with us. As Psalm 46 reminds us, He is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea. And it goes on and ends by saying, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Sisters and brothers, I challenge you today to remember that even in the midst of this pandemic, even in the midst of all of our anxiety, grief, sorrows, and frustrations, God is with us. Just as he was with Peter and the disciples, he will walk these storms with us. Just as he was with Dr. King, God will remind us that he never leaves us alone. And just as my wonderful earthly dad, I love and miss you, Dad, was with me when I learned to drive, our Heavenly Father is with us, guiding us through life's many challenges. So take time today and throughout the time of this storm, this pandemic, and think of ways in which you can remind yourselves that God is with you. Perhaps you might write your thoughts in a journal. Maybe you might turn to music to remind you of God's presence. And as always, this is a pretty good book to turn to. And whatever you do, remember that God is with us. God is with us. Amen.